Welcome to Founding Chronicles. Before we dive in, make sure to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Now, let's step back into history and uncover the haunting tale of the Hartwell family, a story of tragedy, madness, and the dark legacy that consumed 5 wives in the rolling hills and quiet farmlands of late 19th century Massachusetts. The Hartwell estate sat as a proud, imposing symbol of a family that had long been respected in the community. To outsiders, the Hartwells appeared ordinary, if not prosperous. John Hartwell, the patriarch, a stern man with a commanding presence, was known for his wealth in land and livestock, his shrewd eye in town politics, and his meticulous household. The estate itself, a large, weathered farmhouse of dark oak and slate roofs, had stood for generations, sheltering the lineage of Hartwells, who had long prided themselves on discipline, order, and reputation. Yet behind the polished exterior, shadows lingered, secrets whispered in the corridors, and a family legacy darker than any outsider could imagine quietly unfolded. John Hartwell was a man of his time, a strict, conservative figure who demanded obedience and decorum from all who lived under his roof. He had married young, and in a span of less than 2 decades, he would take 5 wives, one after another. To the community, this was not entirely unheard of. Widowers remarried quickly in those times, and sometimes the pace of mourning seemed short to the casual observer. But in the case of the Hartwells, there was something far more unsettling. Each of John's wives, drawn into the household with hope and promise, would, within a few short years, descend into deep, inexplicable madness. It was as if the house itself, with its towering beams, shadowed halls, and heavy, foreboding presence, absorbed the light and joy from each woman, leaving only fear and despair in its wake. The first of John's wives, Elizabeth Whitmore, came from a respected family nearby. She was young, gentle, and known for her soft smile and lively spirit. In her early days at the Hartwell estate, she brought warmth to the cold, formal household. She tended the gardens, filled the halls with music, and hoped to raise a family in peace. But neighbors would later recount that Elizabeth's cheerfulness soon began to falter. Small episodes of anxiety crept into her life. She would pace the corridors at night, whispering to herself, and often stood at the windows, staring at the woods beyond the estate, as if seeing visions only she could perceive. Within 5 years, Elizabeth's mind had deteriorated to the point that she could no longer function within the home. She was admitted to the nearby asylum, a place with iron bars, echoing halls, and an air of despair, and she would never return. Then came Margaret Thompson, the second wife. She had been drawn to John Hartwell by a mixture of respect and admiration for his social standing. She moved into the estate with high hopes, believing she could succeed where Elizabeth had faltered. Margaret was intelligent, meticulous, and determined to carve her own place within the household. But the same slow, creeping darkness began to take hold. Neighbors reported her wandering the property at odd hours, speaking to unseen figures, and suffering fits of unrelenting terror that no one could explain. Despite careful attention, her condition worsened, culminating in a breakdown so severe that she was removed from the estate. Those who saw her later described a woman lost entirely, speaking incoherently, her once sharp eyes dull and vacant. The third, fourth, and fifth wives followed a similar tragic pattern. Each entered the Hartwell household with hope, love, or, at the very least, acceptance of her role. Each succumbed in time to a relentless mental deterioration. There was a whisper among townsfolk that the house itself was cursed, that a shadow lingered in the corners, feeding off the vitality of women who dared to live within its walls. Some speculated that John's severity and cold nature drove the women to despair. Others believed the family was touched by some hereditary curse, a darkness that followed them through generations. Whatever the truth, the result was always the same. Madness consumed, and the wives were lost to institutions or secluded rooms, leaving John Hartwell to remarry in the endless cycle that would define his life. Historical records from the era give hints, but no clear answers. Letters and diaries recovered from the Hartwell estate reveal a household tense with unspoken fears. One diary entry, written by the youngest of the wives before her mind finally gave way, describes the suffocating weight of the house. It is as though the walls breathe with malice, as though the very floor beneath me wants to swallow me whole. I am never alone, and yet I am always lonely. I fear I will vanish, and no one will remember I was ever here. Such accounts paint a picture not merely of mental illness, but of a living environment so oppressive that it could drain the spirit of even the strongest person. Yet, John Hartwell's life continued in its outward normalcy. He was a figure of the town, attending church every Sunday, engaging in civic duties, and maintaining the appearance of propriety. To the outside world, he remained untouched by the tragedies within his walls. But those who dared to see closer, the servants, distant relatives, and neighbors who glimpsed the estate's inner workings, knew differently. They spoke of eerie silences after a wife's departure, of windows that refused to stay closed, of sudden chills in rooms long empty, and of shadows that moved where no light fell. These accounts, passed down orally in the local community, contributed to the Hartwell estate's reputation as a house of whispers, a place where hope went to die. By the time John took his fifth wife, the pattern was no longer a shocking surprise, but a grim expectation. Families in neighboring towns warned their daughters away, citing the mysterious madness that had claimed 4 women before her. But the cycle was unbroken. John, perhaps blind to the curse he seemed to carry, or perhaps compelled by some need that no one could name, remarried. History records her fate as tragically inevitable, though few specifics survive. Only the echoes of her despair remain in the fragmented letters, the faded photographs, and the memories of the community, passed down as cautionary tales and hushed stories at gatherings. The Hartwell tragedy raises questions that historians and psychologists alike still ponder. Was this the result of an oppressive household, a hereditary mental illness, or something more supernatural, a shadow that haunted the family line? Some suggest that John Hartwell's relentless authority and emotional coldness created an environment where women could not thrive. Others believe the estate itself, built on the land, of old colonial tensions and long-forgotten family secrets, somehow carried a weight that no human could bear. Whatever the cause, the consequences are clear, and they remain shocking to this day. A line of women, 5 in total, each brought to madness in the shadow of one man and one house. By the end of the 19th century, the Hartwell estate stood as a grim monument to this cycle of despair. Photographs of the family, rare and faded, show stern faces, formal poses, and women whose smiles seem strained or forced. Local newspapers of the era, when they dared mention the family at all, did so with cautious language, hinting at tragedy without offering explanation. Oral histories tell of a house where laughter never lasted, where doors would slam in the night, and where a chill would descend even on warm summer days. For historians, these accounts are fragmentary yet haunting, a record of a family whose private horrors rivaled the dramatic events of the nation at large. The story of the Hartwell wives is not one of sensational fiction, but of lived tragedy, deeply entwined with the history of American family life, mental health understanding, and the societal expectations of women in the 1800s. It is a story that reminds us of the fragility of the human mind, the dangers of isolation and control, and the mysterious forces, whether psychological, environmental, or something beyond comprehension, that can shape a household and a family line for generations. By the time John Hartwell's second wife, Margaret Thompson, fully settled into the estate, a pattern of despair had already begun to etch itself into the walls. Unlike Elizabeth, Margaret had been warned vague rumors whispered by townswomen, who remembered Elizabeth's tragic fate. Yet she moved forward, determined that she could withstand whatever shadows lingered there. The first few months were promising. Margaret's voice brought music to the hallways. She oversaw the household, staffed with fairness, and she tried to maintain a sense of normalcy that the house itself seemed to resist. But gradually, small fissures appeared in her composure, subtle signs that the estate, or perhaps the presence of John himself, had an invisible grip over the women who entered its doors. Neighbors reported that Margaret began pacing the halls, late into the night, clutching her skirts as if warding off invisible intruders. She would speak softly to the walls, sometimes in urgent whispers, as though negotiating with unseen forces. Servants, reluctant to speak for fear of reprisal, admitted that strange things had occurred, doors creaking open by themselves, shadows lingering unnaturally, and occasional bursts of laughter or sobbing that seemed to emanate from empty rooms. Margaret's letters, carefully preserved by her family, reveal a mind slowly unraveling. In one entry, she wrote, "I hear them in the night, though no one is there. I see their faces in the corners, but when I turn, they vanish. I cannot escape this house. It follows me even when I close my eyes." As her sanity eroded, the estate itself seemed to tighten around her. Rooms that had once felt grand and comforting became stifling and claustrophobic. The kitchens, once bustling with warmth and the smell of baking bread, now smelled faintly of decay, though no cause could be found. Hallways felt longer, shadows darker, and Margaret's sleep was plagued by vivid nightmares of isolation and persecution. By the second year of her marriage, she was unable to participate in social gatherings, even those arranged by John to maintain the family's reputation. Margaret's decline was swift and total, mirroring the experience of Elizabeth. Before her, she, too, was eventually confined to an institution. Her departure met with polite concern from the community, but whispered terror behind closed doors. Then came the third wife, Sarah Whitfield, a woman of striking beauty and intelligence, known in town for her charm and sharp wit. She entered the Hartwell estate with cautious optimism, aware of the fates of her predecessors, but believing that her own resilience might make the difference. Yet she quickly discovered that the estate had a subtle, almost insidious way of infiltrating a person's mind. It was not just the isolation. It was the way the house seemed to shift in response to her presence. Hallways felt narrower, ceilings lower, rooms colder. Objects appeared displaced when she wasn't looking, yet when she returned, they seemed exactly where they had been. Before, as if mocking her perception, Sarah began confiding in the local minister, seeking solace in someone outside the oppressive environment of the estate. But even that relief was fleeting. Letters she wrote described sudden fits of rage, irrational fear, and moments of complete dissociation. "I do not know where I end and the house begins," she penned in one particularly haunting note. "It watches me, waits for me to falter. And when I do, it does not forgive." Her descent into madness was, in the eyes of the townspeople, almost inevitable. They had begun to regard the Hartwell estate as cursed, a place that could steal the vitality of any woman who entered. Sarah's confinement followed the familiar pattern, removed from the estate, institutionalized, and largely erased from public memory, except for the cautionary whispers that haunted local gatherings. The fourth wife, Anne Caldwell, represented a brief glimmer of hope for the Hartwell family. Unlike the previous wives, Anne attempted to assert herself, establishing routines, hosting gatherings, and maintaining the estate's gardens. She believed that engagement with the outside world might shield her from the oppressive atmosphere. that had claimed her predecessors. Yet, despite her efforts, the creeping darkness could not be thwarted. Anne began experiencing sudden, unexplainable tremors of fear-panic attacks that left her unable to function, hallucinations that seemed so real she would scream at family members for things that never occurred. The estate had grown familiar with her patterns, adapting in ways that seemed almost conscious. The creak of the stairs at night, the flickering of candlelight casting shadows where no one stood, and the oppressive silence in rooms meant for rest and refuge. By the time the fifth wife, Margaret's distant cousin, entered the household, the townspeople were openly fearful. Mothers warned daughters to avoid the Hartwell estate. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid passing the front gates, and even John's acquaintances began to question the wisdom of another marriage. Yet, as with the previous women, the cycle of hope followed by despair continued. The fifth wife, whose name has been lost to history in fragments of legal and medical records, succumbed to the same relentless descent into madness. The reasons were never fully recorded. She was committed quietly, with minimal fanfare, her absence barely noted in newspapers or town records. The consistent collapse of these 5 women raises a haunting question. Was it purely the psychological pressure exerted by John Hartwell, the social isolation inherent in the estate, or something far more sinister? Medical records from nearby asylums indicate that each woman suffered from what was then broadly classified as melancholia or hysteria, conditions poorly understood in the 19th century. The treatments were rudimentary, sometimes cruel cold, baths, restraints, and isolation, often worsening the conditions they were intended to treat. In the case of the Hartwell wives, there is no evidence of external abuse that could fully explain the rapid decline, suggesting that either the environment, genetic predisposition, or some combination contributed to the inexorable tragedy. The community, meanwhile, became increasingly wary of the Hartwell estate. Families spoke in hushed tones about the house and the menacing presence that seemed to permeate it. Children were warned not to play near the gates, and travelers passing through the town would sometimes report an uneasy feeling when crossing the grounds, as if invisible eyes followed them. It was said that on certain nights, the sound of crying could be heard drifting from the estate, though no one dared approach to investigate. Local ministers preached caution, recounting the story of the Hartwell wives as a lesson in the fragility of the human spirit and the dangers of isolation and authoritarian control. Despite these warnings, John Hartwell continued his life largely unscathed in the eyes of the public. He attended church, managed his lands, and maintained the appearance of a respected patriarch. Few questioned the darkness behind the estate's doors, and those who did were met with polite dismissal or intimidation. Yet the house itself seemed to bear the memory of the women who had lived and suffered there. Objects moved as if remembering past hands, floors groaned under the weight of unseen footsteps, and the oppressive atmosphere seemed almost tangible to anyone who entered. The estate had become not just a home, but a monument to the tragedy that had unfolded within it, a house that consumed the vitality and sanity of 5 women in succession, leaving only whispers, shadows, and the faintest echo of laughter long. Vanished by the close of the 19th century, the Hartwell estate had gained a reputation not merely as a family home, but as a site of ongoing dread. Scholars and historians looking back find in its story a stark illustration of the intersection of social expectations, gender roles, mental health, and environment. The plight of the Hartwell wives is more than a footnote. It is a window into the human cost of neglect, misunderstanding, and the mysterious, sometimes inexplicable weight that a house or a family legacy can impose on those who inhabit it. By the turn of the century, the Hartwell estate had become less of a home and more a symbol of dread. John Hartwell himself aged, his once commanding presence dulled by years of isolation, the weight of his repeated tragedies, and the quiet whispers that haunted the halls. though he continued to maintain the outward trappings of respectability, hosting gatherings, attending church, and managing the family lands inside the house. A profound emptiness lingered. The voices of the 5 wives, though absent in body, seemed to echo perpetually, a testament to the lasting mark they had left on the estate. The children of John Hartwell, if any survived, were rare and often removed from the household early. Records are sparse, but accounts suggest that the oppressive atmosphere and the repeated tragedies left little room for nurturing family life. Servants recalled hearing shrill cries, echoing through the halls late at night, and finding objects displaced as if by invisible hands. The estate had become self-contained, a closed world where grief and madness were tangible presences. Those who lived there found themselves quietly shaping their behaviors around the house's unspoken demands, walking softly, speaking in whispers, and avoiding the rooms where each wife had suffered most. Stories of the Hartwell wives traveled beyond the town, carried by relatives, servants, and curious neighbors. The narrative was always the same: a beautiful, intelligent, and kind-hearted woman entered the house with hope, only to vanish into insanity within a few years. These stories sparked fear and fascination, creating a local legend that would endure for decades. Young girls were warned not to marry hastily, not only for social reasons, but for fear that they might meet the same fate as the Hartwell women. The estate became a cautionary tale whispered at church gatherings and family dinners, a reminder of the fragile boundary between normalcy and madness. Psychologists and historians who later examined the case suggest a convergence of factors that contributed to the tragic outcomes. The role of social isolation, limited understanding of mental health, and the immense pressure on women to maintain composure and obedience in the 19th century cannot be underestimated. Each wife entered the estate with hope and a willingness to adapt, but the oppressive expectations, combined with the possible presence of hereditary mental illness, created conditions ripe for breakdown. The house itself, large and foreboding, may have amplified feelings of confinement and fear. Windows were often shuttered, hallways long and narrow, and the constant silence of a house largely empty of peers or equals could magnify the smallest anxieties into crises of mind and spirit. Yet it was not just the environment that seemed responsible. John Hartwell's personality played a pivotal role in the story. Descriptions of him from contemporaries paint a man of stern authority, emotionally reserved, and obsessed with control. He maintained strict rules, expected unwavering obedience, and tolerated no deviation from his standards. While not outwardly cruel, his inability to show warmth or empathy created a psychological pressure that, when compounded with the already stressful environment, likely accelerated the mental decline of each wife. The repeated pattern of marriage, hope, and subsequent madness suggests a combination of situational, psychological, and possibly hereditary forces at play. The community's awareness of the estate's dark legacy began to shape their interactions with the Hartwell family. Visitors were scarce, and business with the estate was conducted cautiously. Even tradesmen and neighbors who had long-standing relationships with the family found themselves hesitant, noting the peculiar energies surrounding the house. There were reports of inexplicable cold drafts in rooms sealed for years, the distant sound of weeping when no one else was present, and the occasional fleeting sighting of a woman in the upper windows at twilight, disappearing the moment anyone approached. These accounts, though anecdotal, contributed to the enduring aura of the estate as a place of unease, a house where the past lingered in ways that were felt but could not be fully explained. Over time, the Hartwell tragedy came to reflect broader societal challenges. The plight of the wives illuminated the limited options available to women in the 19th century: limited autonomy, restricted access to mental health care, and immense societal expectations. Their suffering was compounded by the inability of families and medical practitioners of the time to recognize, understand, or effectively treat mental illness. The repeated breakdowns within a single household became a microcosm of the larger struggles faced by women in similar social positions across America. In a time when a woman's worth was often tied to her appearance, obedience, and capacity for domestic management, any deviation from the expected norms could be magnified, pathologized, and ultimately lead to tragic outcomes. By the early 1900s. Even as the Hartwell estate continued under John's oversight, the cycle of tragedy had left an indelible mark. Each wife, confined to asylums or secluded within the house, had become a symbol of the dangers lurking behind closed doors, of the fragility of human resilience, and of the invisible weight a home could impose on those living within it. Visitors who dared approach noted the stifling stillness, the oppressive silence, and the sense that the house itself had absorbed years of sorrow. Objects seemed to retain a memory of the people who had touched them. A chair in the parlor carried the faint impression of where a woman had once sat, weeping quietly, lost to a mind no longer her own. The legacy of the Hartwell wives persisted. Long after John Hartwell himself passed away, scholars who later studied the estate found accounts of 5 women whose lives were systematically eroded by a combination of environmental, social, and psychological factors. These cases became part of local folklore and were occasionally cited in medical and sociological studies of the period, illustrating the challenges of diagnosing and treating mental illness in an era of limited knowledge. Yet, despite scholarly attention, much of the story remains shrouded in mystery. Personal letters were destroyed, medical records incomplete, and many details lost to time. What remains is the haunting narrative of a house, a man, and 5 women whose lives were consumed, each in turn, by forces that were visible only in the tragedy they left behind. Even today, the Hartwell estate is remembered not only as a physical location, but as a symbol of the interplay between human ambition, authority, and fragility. Its history reminds us that wealth, power, and social standing offer no immunity against psychological collapse, and that the environment in which we live can exert a profound influence over the mind and spirit. The story of the 5 wives serves as both a cautionary tale and a somber reflection on the historical treatment of mental health, societal pressures, and the enduring mysteries that surround human behavior. As the decades passed, the Hartwell estate grew quieter, its halls echoing only with the weight of memory. John Hartwell's own death marked the end of an era, yet it did little to lift the shadow that had fallen over the house. The 5 wives, each lost to madness in succession, were long gone, some institutionalized, some secluded, some reduced to fragments in the memories of those who had glimpsed their suffering. But the estate remained a monument to their lives, and more tragically, to their unfulfilled hopes. The townspeople, who had once whispered cautionary tales behind closed doors, eventually began speaking openly about the estate. By the early 20th century, the Hartwell story had become a part of local legend. Children dared each other to walk past the estate at twilight, claiming to see faint figures in the windows, pale faces watching silently from upper floors. Adults told of strange noises, unexplainable chills, and the oppressive feeling that the house remembered every tear, every scream, every desperate plea for release. These stories, though often dismissed by outsiders, were passed down through generations as both warning and mystery, ensuring that the Hartwell tragedy remained alive long after the final wife had vanished from living memory. Historians and social commentators began to reflect on the broader significance of the Hartwell saga. The pattern of repeated marriages and subsequent madness highlighted the dangers inherent in isolation, rigid authority, and the lack of understanding about mental health. The wives had entered the house with optimism, hope, and a willingness to adapt, only to be swallowed by an environment that was physically imposing, emotionally stifling, and socially isolating. Their stories offered insight into the immense pressures faced by women in the 19th century, pressures to conform, to remain cheerful, to manage households, and to endure without complaint. Any deviation from these rigid expectations often led to personal collapse, medicalization, or institutionalization, as the community struggled to explain behaviors it did not understand. Yet beyond the social and psychological explanations, there remained an undeniable air of the uncanny surrounding. The Hartwell estate. Contemporary accounts, letters, and oral histories hint at experiences that defy easy explanation, doors that opened and closed on their own, footsteps echoing in empty hallways, shadows lingering in corners long after the sun had set. Servants and neighbors alike spoke of the oppressive stillness that would descend during certain hours, a silence so heavy it seemed to press upon the chest and dull the mind. These anecdotes, combined with the tragic pattern of the wives' decline, fueled speculation that the estate itself bore a kind of memory or consciousness, a house that absorbed the anguish of its inhabitants and reflected it back, amplifying despair until the women could no longer endure it. For John Hartwell, the cost of these tragedies was both visible and invisible. Publicly, he remained a respected figure, his wealth and social standing largely shielding him from scrutiny. Privately, however, the repeated loss of wives and the eerie atmosphere of his home must have weighed heavily. Some speculate that he became increasingly withdrawn and stern, perhaps unaware of the depth of his complicity in their suffering. Others suggest that he simply accepted the cycle as inevitable, a consequence of a mysterious fate or family curse he could neither understand nor escape. Whatever the case, the Hartwell estate remained a place of silence, grief, and unspoken horrors, a physical embodiment of the family's dark legacy. As the 20th century progressed, the estate changed hands, but its reputation persisted. Later, owners often reported strange occurrences, rooms that felt unusually cold, fleeting glimpses of figures in windows, and the inexplicable sensation of being watched. Some claimed that the house resisted change, that no matter how carefully it was renovated or modernized, the weight of the past persisted. The story of the 5 wives, each consumed by madness, became a focal point for these tales, ensuring that the legacy of suffering and despair continued to shape perceptions of the estate long after the original family line had faded from prominence. Yet even amid this darkness, the story of the Hartwell wives offers a cautionary reflection on human resilience, societal pressures, and the importance of understanding mental health. Their experiences illustrate the devastating consequences of neglect, misunderstanding, and oppressive environments. They remind us that no social standing, wealth, or outward appearance can shield one from psychological suffering, and that empathy, support, and awareness are essential to preventing similar tragedies. By examining the Hartwell legacy, historians, psychologists, and storytellers alike gain insight into the challenges faced by women in a bygone era and the enduring impact of the environments in which we live. Ultimately, the Hartwell estate stands as a monument not only to tragedy but to memory itself. Its walls absorbed the lives of 5 women who entered with hope and promise, only to be consumed by despair. The estate embodies a haunting truth, that human suffering can leave an indelible mark on places as well as on the hearts and minds of those who endure it. Even today, the story of the Hartwell wives is told with hushed reverence, a reminder of the fragility of the human mind and the lingering weight of past tragedies. Visitors, historians, and descendants alike confront the same eerie realization. While the bodies of the wives are gone, their presence continues to resonate, an echo of sorrow, a lesson in empathy, and a cautionary tale etched into the very fabric of the estate. The Hartwell family tragedy is a story that endures because it speaks to universal human fears, the fear of isolation, the fear of losing oneself, and the fear of environments that can erode the spirit. It is a story of women who suffered quietly, whose voices were often ignored, and whose lives were systematically dismantled by forces both visible and invisible. And it is a story that forces us to consider how history remembers, how communities respond to tragedy, and how the past, even when forgotten in official records, continues to shape the spaces we inhabit and the lives we lead. As the sun sets over the rolling hills once occupied by the Hartwell estate, one can still feel the weight of history pressing gently on the air. The house no longer teems with life, yet the memory of 5 women, consumed by madness, lingers in every shadowed corner. It is a haunting, powerful reminder that some legacies are not written in stone or ink alone, but in the silent, enduring echoes of lives profoundly affected by the worlds around them. And it is in these echoes that the story of the Hartwell wives lives on, challenging us to remember, reflect, and honor the fragile beauty of the human spirit, even in the face of overwhelming darkness.